The girl's head hit the sunlight first as the priest dragged her forward into the courtyard. The heat wrapped around her like punishment, burning her skin even before the rituals began. Her name was Nefret, and she was only 9 years old. She didn't know she'd been sold. Her father had told her she was being honoured, chosen to serve the gods, destined for a sacred life. But what he hadn't told her was that this gift to the temple was not a choice. It was payment. He owed a debt he couldn't repay in silver or grain, so he repaid it in flesh. From the moment Nefret stepped across the temple threshold, she stopped being a daughter. She became an offering. The courtyard was filled with chanting, rhythmic and low, echoing off the colossal columns like thunder inside stone. A priest with a bronze razor stood waiting. He said words she didn't understand as he gripped her head and began shaving it. Each pull of the blade tore away a braid of black hair until the ground around her feet was carpeted in what had been her pride and her mother's hours of careful braiding. The last scrape of metal left her scalp raw and stinging. When she began to cry, an older woman in white robes struck her hard across the face. "Servants of Amun do not weep," she said coldly. "You have no tears now. You have no name now. You belong to the god." That moment marked the beginning of her new life, a life that would last decades, a life of service and silence. You've seen the temples of Egypt, the towering gates of Karnak, the shimmering columns, the walls carved with gods and kings. But those stones don't tell you what happened behind them. They don't tell you what the priests did to the children brought there. The temples were not only places of worship, they were systems of control. The girls taken there were called pure ones, wives of the god, servants of the divine. Beautiful titles that hid the truth. They were taken young, often as payment for debt, as gifts of devotion, or as tribute from conquered lands. They were told they were chosen by the gods. In reality, they were owned by men. The first thing the temple did was erase who they were. After her head was shaved, Nefret was taken into a stone chamber filled with the smell of incense and salt. 2 priests and 2 women waited beside a pool of water that shimmered under the torchlight. They told her the ritual was called purification. It sounded harmless. It wasn't. They stripped her naked and told her she was about to become pure for the gods. The water was cold and mixed with natron, a mineral used to dry out corpses during mummification. When she flinched, one of the priests smiled and said, "Do not resist." The gods are watching. His hands moved over her body as he murmured prayers she couldn't understand. When she tried to step away, the priest's voice hardened. "If you fail this test, you bring shame upon your family." That was how fear became obedience. By the time the ritual was done, her body ached. Her eyes were red from tears she wasn't allowed to shed, and her spirit was breaking. They gave her a new name, She Who Belongs. They told her never to speak her old one again. If she ever said it aloud, she would be punished. That was how the temples maintained control. They didn't just demand faith, they demanded identity. The girls who lived inside those walls owned nothing, not even themselves. Their clothes, their names, their voices, all belonged to the gods, and by extension to the priests who claimed to speak for those gods. Their daily lives were mechanical and silent. They woke before dawn to wash in cold water, to grind grain, to weave linen for temple offerings. They sang hymns until their throats burned. They ate in silence, slept on reed mats, and spoke only when spoken to. Every whisper was a risk. Every question was a sin. The silence wasn't just discipline, it was programming. It taught them that obedience was safety and individuality was death. Outsiders saw holiness. The girls lived servitude, and eventually even that servitude was given a divine name. When Nefret turned 14, the high priest announced that she had been chosen for the Festival of Divine Union, the most sacred ritual of all. They told her the god Amun would take her as his bride. She didn't understand what that meant, but she was told it was an honor. She was bathed again, perfumed with oils, and dressed in fine linen so thin it barely concealed her body. They led her into the inner sanctuary where no ordinary person could go. Incense filled the air. The high priest stood before her, his face hidden behind a golden mask shaped like the gods. He told her she had been chosen by Amun himself, that her body would be the bridge between mortal and divine, that her submission would ensure Egypt's prosperity. The chanting grew louder as the other priests circled around them. The high priest stepped closer, still wearing the mask. Nefret froze. He told her to kneel. When she hesitated, someone behind her whispered, "Do not resist, or the god will curse your family." She knelt. The mask came off. The god was a man, and in the name of holiness he did what no god would ever do. The next morning, the temple recorded the ritual as a success. The scroll said the god's blessing had been fulfilled, that Egypt's fertility had been renewed. No one wrote what it had cost. No one mentioned the girl who bled in silence, who walked the corridors afterward in a fog of fear and disbelief. To the priests, she wasn't a person. She was proof. For years afterward, Nefret moved through the temple like a ghost. She did her duties. She smiled when commanded. She learned to make her face a mask. Around her, new girls arrived, just as she once had, crying, trembling, still clinging to the belief that the gods had chosen them. Older women repeated the same words the priest had told them years before. Obey, and you will be safe. Disobey, and you will be erased. That was how the system fed itself. Trauma turned into tradition. By 16, Nefret was pregnant. The priests called it divine favour, a holy conception. They told her the god had blessed her womb. She didn't know which man it was, and she didn't ask. When she gave birth to a daughter, she was allowed to keep the baby for 3 years before the child was taken away to begin temple training. The cycle repeated itself. Generation after generation of women born, broken and buried in the name of the divine. Some of them tried to resist, but resistance was death. The priests called it returning to the gods. Those who disobeyed were taken outside the temple walls into the desert and abandoned there, left for the sun and sand to finish the punishment. The rest stayed quiet. That's how power survived, not by strength, but by silence. And yet some still found ways to leave their mark. Archaeologists have found faint carvings hidden under paint, scratched into the stone in places no one was meant to look. A single sentence repeated in different temples by different hands in slightly different forms. I remember my mother. We were not blessed. I am still here. Those words are all that remain of women like Nefret. The priests built monuments of stone and gold. The women left whispers carved in secret. The temples outlasted them, but the scratches endured. So when you walk through those ancient halls, when you look up at the towering columns and the painted ceilings, remember that beauty can lie. The same walls that tell stories of gods and glory also hide the truth of what was done in their names. For every king remembered, there were hundreds of girls erased. For every hymn of praise, there was a voice silenced forever. This was not holiness. This was power disguised as purity. These temples were not sanctuaries. They were cages made of faith. And what the priests did inside them, what they did to those girls, was worse than death. The silence of the temple had a sound of its own. It was the hum of 1,000 unspoken words, of prayers recited mechanically by people who no longer believed in the answers. Nefret moved through that silence as though she were part of the architecture, one more feature of the stone that enclosed her. For years she had obeyed every command. She had washed, chanted, woven, and bowed until obedience was instinct. But obedience does not erase memory. In the dark corners of her mind, her childhood still whispered, the scent of river reeds, her father's voice before the debt, the laughter of the other children in the sun. Those memories were dangerous. They reminded her there was a world beyond the walls. Egypt itself was changing. The Nile floods were failing. The sky stayed dry too long, and the granaries began to empty. When famine crept toward Thebes, the priests blamed impurity. They said the gods' servants had sinned in secret, that their lack of faith had angered the heavens. Punishment always travelled downward. Each drought meant more inspections, more purifications, more corrections. The priests claimed they were cleansing sin, but everyone knew they were cleansing fear, reminding the women that the temple owned them completely. Among the servants there were whispers of rebellion. They came from a Nubian woman named Mutia, older than the rest, who had been captured in a war long forgotten by the men who fought it. Mutia still remembered her mother tongue, though she never spoke it loud. At night, when the guards passed, she would hum a melody from her homeland, soft, rhythmic, full of grief. The tune spread quietly from mat to mat until half the dormitory hummed it in their sleep. It became a language of defiance that no priest could translate. Nefret began to hum it too. For the first time since childhood, she felt something that resembled hope. Hope is dangerous inside a system built on fear. The overseers noticed the change, the brief glances exchanged. the faint smiles that shouldn't have existed. One morning Mutia was gone. The priest said she had been chosen for special service. None of the women believed it. The hum stopped that night, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like mourning. Yet even silence can carry meaning. When the women worked in the weaving halls, they began to hide symbols in their patterns, small, deliberate flaws that looked like accidents, but, when seen together, spelled phrases of remembrance. I am still here. We endure. The priest never noticed, but the women did. Each thread was an act of quiet defiance. Years blurred into decades. The temple aged with them, its paint fading, its pillars cracking under the weight of centuries of sand. Tourists today see those cracks as beauty, proof of antiquity. But to the women who lived there, they were proof that nothing, not even the gods' houses, lasts forever. Nefret grew old watching those cracks widen. She trained new girls, repeated the old lessons, enforced the same silence that had been forced on her. Yet beneath the obedience, something inside her refused to die. She began to write, not on papyrus that could be confiscated, but on the back of broken tiles, on shards of pottery discarded near the kitchens. Her hands shook as she carved the words with the stolen tool. They called it service. It was bondage. They called it purity. It was fear. The other women followed her example. Over the years, the temple's lower chambers filled with fragments of unrecorded history. Archaeologists would one day call them graffiti. They were, in truth, confessions written by people who had been denied voices. By the time Nefret reached 50, she knew she would never leave the temple alive. Yet she also knew that the stories carved in secret would outlive the priests. She had seen enough to understand that empires fall, faiths change, but words have a way of surviving. On her final night, she sat beside a small oil lamp, the light flickering across the walls that had once terrified her. She whispered her true name, the one the priests had forbidden, and felt the weight of years lift from her chest. When the morning came, she was gone. The priest buried her with 3 other women in a shared pit, no marker, no ceremony. To them, her death was another routine task completed. But hidden behind the stone basin in the purification room, her final message remained scratched into the wall. Remember us. We were people. Centuries later, when the desert reclaimed the temple and scholars came to study its ruins, one of them brushed dust from that same inscription. The words were faint, almost lost to time, but still legible. And in that moment, after 3,000 years of silence, Nefret was heard again. The temples still stand. The gods have long since fallen, but the stones remember, and so should we.